Okay, so normally this is the part where I would say, hey, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. But since I'm the vice president and I'm the one responsible for setting up speakers, I would just be thanking myself. So instead, I'll just thank you all for attending, and I hope this presentation will be very informative and helpful, and um, that you get a lot out of it. And I'm also very, very hopeful that my cat doesn't decide to jump on me and scare me halfway through this presentation. So just a forewarning in case that happens. Okay, so I just kind of want to go over a little bit of what we're going to cover. I'm going to go through these slides, and this is the third part, really, of a three-part presentation group that I started last year. Many of you were probably there when the first part we discussed how birds migrate, what science has taught us about that. And then the second part of the presentation was more covering why birds get lost and what we understand about why that happens, and how birds that are not supposed to be in Michigan, didn't read their range maps and ended up in Michigan. And this is the third part of that, which is we're going to really kind of cover how to document that. Who do you tell? Um, how do you go about doing that? Um, and that's really kind of the focus of this program. I will have, it's not quite, it's more information heavy than photo heavy, as some of my other presentations are. So I decided to throw in some photos of rare birds that I've documented in the past and submitted documentation for, just to make things a little more interesting if you like the bird photos. So the reason I wanted to do this, because when I started birding back in 2012, so well over 10 years ago now, I started using eBird, and I learned about the Michigan Bird Records Committee and started submitting documentation to them when I would see rare birds. And um, oftentimes my documentation would not get accepted. And I think that's something that for a lot of people who are used to using eBird and who may have submitted to the MBRC before has probably experienced and wonders, well, what went wrong? Why did my documentation not get accepted? Um, so we're going to kind of talk about what you need to do to document a bird well versus the way I was doing it early on. Um, I also saw that during my time with the Michigan Bird Records Committee as a voting member that oftentimes there were probably a lot of records that probably would have gotten accepted if the documentation had just simply been better. It wasn't necessarily that we thought that, as a committee or me personally voting, it wasn't necessarily that I thought the bird was misidentified. It was more a question of really the documentation has to kind of meet a certain level in order to really be accepted into the record. Um, so just some good skills, general skills to have if you're getting into documenting rarities is knowing your local species well. So you know when something shows up, when it's unusual, and what other species are likely. Um, we talked a little bit last year about vagrancy and expected vagrancy and unexpected vagrancy, but there are some birds that show up in Michigan relatively frequently, but still not enough to really be considered normal and still oftentimes require documentation, so we can capture that information. Um, Good observation skills are going to be necessary so you can view birds in great amount of detail, understand what you're looking at. Um, Also, note-taking skills I've found are very essential, especially as you get used to it in the field through eBird or whatever you're using. Just I've developed kind of a shorthand that I can expand later, but I really want to get those details in the field right away. so I don't have to rely on my memory, which is not what it used to be. Okay, and a few things we're not going to be covering, how to find rare birds. We're not going to cover that because that's really the way you find rare birds is to go out birding a lot. Um, and especially going into high quality habitat in places where migrants tend to congregate, Whitefish Point, Point Muay, areas like that. If you want to start chasing rare birds, join groups. There are Facebook groups, listservs. Discord has become one that's really popular among Michigan birders for helping to announce that rare birds have shown up and where to go see them. Um, but also remember that rare birds are just that, they are rare. So don't expect to be going out all the time and finding birds that are rare enough you have to, or that, they're on the review list for the records committee frequently. Um, I've been birding since 2012, like I mentioned, and I have seen quite a few rare birds in Michigan, and I've documented quite a few. Um, but the number that I have actually found on my own, I think amounts to one in all that time. So if you're just a casual birder, you're not somebody who's say, doing point counts up at Whitefish Point during migration season, you don't really expect to find rare birds very often, or at least you shouldn't be, because it just doesn't happen that frequently. We're also not going to cover how to identify rare birds. It's not really much of a identification presentation. Um, One thing you do want to keep in mind, have a really good field guide. A Sibley's, National Geographic, a Peterson's, something that's up to date, that's comprehensive. I don't recommend, if you're going to really get into chasing birds, a lot of the field guides that are sold in like tourist shops and stuff that are birds of Michigan that probably only cover about a third of the birds that show up in the state during a year, because you're not going to find any of the birds we're talking about tonight in that kind of guide, and you're probably not going to find a lot of the birds that you will see if you're actively birding. Um, the other thing I would say about your field guide is use it frequently. Probably should have said study it. I study field guides very, very frequently. Almost every night when I'm going to bed, I'm looking through and reviewing a couple of species, um, or I'm looking through the introduction part. And that's the other bullet point there, is use all of it. Your field guide generally will have a very good introduction part that will teach you the parts of birds, the feather groupings, all the important information that knowing those feather groupings, knowing those parts of birds and what they're called, helps you not only to organize your own thoughts when you're in the field, but helps you to better describe it to others, especially if you're submitting documentation. Okay, so why document rare birds? Incidentally, I mentioned the one self-found bird rarity that I have found in Michigan, and that's the one photographed here. I was actually filling in for the hawk counter at Whitefish Point on a day in April of 2021 when this black-billed magpie flew by the hawk deck. Was seen by one other person besides myself. Unfortunately, it didn't. We put the news out, and it wasn't found after that. So anyway, okay, why document rare birds? It can help scientists and researchers and even birders to understand patterns in bird vagrancy. It can help us to gain further understanding of how birds migrate in general, just by looking at their patterns. It can help us to understand how individual species migrate and what their migration corridors are and things of that nature. And it can also help us to understand where a species might end up next. So what is likely, to show up in Michigan at some time, which is very helpful when something, comes up that seems completely off the wall and you're just like, how on earth did that end up here? Versus, okay, that sounds cool. I want to go after it. So it is very important to have this information, but I'm going to actually propose another reason you will want to document the birds that you see, especially the rare birds, in great detail. And that is actually because it can help you become better at bird identification. Um, in order to document birds well, you need to be very observant about the details of birds, all that information that's in the front of your field guide, feather groupings and such, and understanding what details are important for what bird families, bird species, um, everything of that nature. So that is very good to skill to be able to take notes on it, and makes you much more observant, where you might see a really pretty bright blue bird and only pay attention to the fact that it's a pretty bright blue bird. Whereas if you're really trying to be observant and pay attention to detail, you'll start noting leg color and bill color and whether it has any kind of lightly contrasting wing bars, any kind of patterning on the face. So those details are very, very important to help you to really better understand, have a better understanding of bird topology, which is those feather groupings and parts of birds that we talked about. Better understand your field guide. In other words, you're spending more time in your field guide, so you're kind of learning how it works, and gaining a really good idea of what species will show up in Michigan and what ones are less likely to. And all of this information, a lot of it is the questions we're going to go through regarding what's important when documenting birds, is generally something that you go through after the fact. Sometimes in eBird, you're putting it in right in the way, right there in the field. But to do more extensive documentation, like for the Bird Records Committee, a lot of time that is after the fact, and there's a series of questions they're going to ask. But if you know those questions ahead of time and familiarize yourself with them, you can actually start thinking about them while you're in the field, observing the bird, and that's actually very, very, very helpful. And also, you can also gain a better understanding of how to describe birds to others, which is not always as easy as it seems. Especially, if you're a beginning birder or haven't spent a lot of time birding with other birders and trying to explain it to them. I'm sure a lot of us, if you're a birder and you have relatives or friends that are not birders and they want to tell you about this bird that they saw the other day that they're really excited about, and they try to describe it to you, and it sounds like they're, describing some kind of fantasy creature out of C.S. Lewis or something like that. you know, Doing this on a regular basis can help you to kind of be a little more targeted than that and a little more decipherable. So I think that's very helpful. Um, and here's one just on a personal note, and really, I would encourage you, if you're a photographer, um, I would encourage you to provide written documentation, even if you have photographs. Part of the reason for that is photographs are not always as diagnostic as it may seem like. Um, Weird things can happen in photos with color casting, with blurred out sticks or twigs in the foreground, making it look like a bird has a eye line where it really doesn't, things like that. But also because it, again, instead of photographing a bright blue pretty bird, you realize you're photographing a bright blue pretty bird with chestnut wing bars and a pale gray conical bill and black around the face, and you see more details that way on the bird than you will if you're just kind of quickly glancing at it and then moving on. And you really begin to appreciate the beauty of a lot of bird species, even things that get maligned at feeders like blue jays. You just really start paying attention to the details of the feathers, or even some of the little brown birds, shorebirds and things. You look at the intricacy of the feathers that make up their backs, and it's just you can get lost in the detail, and they're just absolutely beautiful. And sometimes it's when you're becoming observant and paying attention to those details, you really learn to appreciate the birds a lot more, and you can even start wondering, why are they evolved like that? Okay, so where to document rare birds? This is I'm going to recommend two places that you document rare birds. There are others. You could use iNaturalist, put your birds on there. I don't use iNaturalist a lot for documenting birds personally. I just find that eBird is a little more user friendly, and I like the fact that eBird has expert reviewers. Sometimes I find iNaturalist is a little more like social media, Facebook or something, where you post a photo, somebody posts a photo and asks for help identifying a bird, and we get 20 responses, and 3 of them are correct, and the other 17 are people just kind of guessing what they think it might be, and sometimes guessing completely wrong. So I just like to stick with eBird and NBRC. Sometimes on social media, when rare birds show up, I'll hear people say, "Hey, you should report that to the DNR." I'm not going to answer for the DNR. I don't work for them. I'm not affiliated with them. But I do suspect that they're probably more interested in our regularly occurring birds and managing for those than they are for rarities, because it's probably not going to influence their policies a whole lot. And I suspect the DNR, maybe even Michigan Natural Features Inventory, are probably more interested in the trends among our local birds than they are um, um, rarities that show up in the state. Not to say, if you know somebody that works at the DNR, they might not appreciate hearing about a cool bird that shows up. I just not I don't think it's going to influence their research quite as much as it will these other organizations. And of course, if you're outside of the United States, Europe, I know, has a popular app called Birda. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's kind of similar to eBird, not so heavily used in the United States. And I'm assuming most of my audience is probably in the United States. So we're going to focus on eBird and the MBRC. So let's talk a little bit about eBird and the MBRC and where they're different and why you would want to submit to them. So eBird, a public database used by birders and researchers, created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If most of you in the audience are birders, you're probably familiar with eBird already, but just cover a few things. eBird uses filters to determine when a bird needs more comments, which these filters can be customized to a region, areas, timeframes within the state rather than covering the whole state. So for instance, a prothonotary warbler showing up around Petoskey would probably require additional comments in eBird, but if you were in Allegan County, it would not. Because of the way the filters are set up. Sometimes eBird, they'll even set up the filters to require documentation for species that are difficult to identify or to separate out from other similar species, and not just rarities. Ibises might be a good example of that, because young ibises can be very difficult to separate. Sometimes eBird will adjust filters based even during special events like backyard bird counts. If it's still called backyard bird count, I don't remember, but oftentimes causes a lot of confusion. And for these reasons, because they do adjust for season, for special events, and for more local regional filters, they oftentimes require more species to be documented or commented on than the MBRC. So that is something to keep in mind. Not every bird that comes up rare on eBird and requiring additional comments is going to be one that the MBRC would like documentation for. Oftentimes with eBird, it's a single reviewer for the area where where you found the bird. One negative about eBird, if you have a really complicated bird to document, it does limit the number of characters you can enter. So in those cases, I usually just say put as much info in there as you can. And if the reviewer needs more information, they'll contact you. And one other important distinction, I believe in eBird, birds are recorded from where the observer sees them. This isn't something in Petoskey or our area that we really encounter a whole lot because we don't have the borders. But if you're on like the border of Ohio or Canada, if you're down around Detroit or up in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, over by Wisconsin, eBird usually you record the species based on where you are located when you see it, which is different from the MBRC, which is more concerned with where the actual bird was. So whether it was on the Canada side of the St. Mary's River, the Michigan side is not so important to eBird, but it is to the MBRC. So let's talk about the MBRC really quick, because this one is probably much less known than eBird. MBRC stands for Michigan Bird Records Committee. The MBRC consists of 7 regular members and 2 alternate members. So unlike eBird, where there's a single reviewer, this is actually committee members voting on the documentation and whether to accept it. And it functions as an autonomous body that serves in an advisory capacity to the Michigan Audubon's research program. Information right off their website there. So their responsibilities include maintaining the official state bird list, including statuses. We're going to look at their website in a little bit. Maintains a list of species requiring documentation, what they would call review species, votes on whether or not to accept records into the official state list. Should be noted that acceptance into the state list could add the species to the state list, or it could change its status. And it can also vote to remove birds from the official state list. And we have seen, maybe not so much to remove them from the state list, but to consider them extirpated is how I should have phrased that. So I'll fix that later. But that did happen while I was serving on the committee a few years ago. After a few years of doing research with various other states and organizations, we did decide to consider that from now on, any observations of northern bobwhite were going to be considered released birds unless evidence of actual breeding, a sustainable breeding population could be discovered. So it's pretty certain there's a loss of habitat there and just not a lot of, most bobwhites out there are probably just being released. Okay, so birds count based on where they are, not where the observer is. And I gotta edit that one too. That's a little confusing. So we're gonna take a quick look at the MBRC's website here. Hopefully I can get this to work. Where is it? Okay. So hopefully you're now all looking at their website, and you can kind of see, I'll put their web address in the chat eventually, but you can kind of see a little bit of what the MBRC does and what information you can find on their website. You can figure out why they exist, recent information. This is something, there's been efforts in the last few years to improve communication from the MBRC. MBRC, much like eBird reviewers, it is a committee made up of volunteers. So especially the last few years with a lot more people getting into birding, that can kind of they can kind of get a backlog. So they're trying to get caught up with a lot of this, but you can kind of see what has happened over the last year. Um, white-winged tern was added to the official state list, and there's a couple more species that have been seen recently. American flamingo, black-chinned hummingbird that might get added if they get accepted. So you can kind of on their front page read the news. You can also see the Michigan checklist. So this is the species that are considered officially part of the Michigan official checklist, and you can see what the definitions for the various statuses are, whether it's regular, casual, accidental, and then you can just browse through and see. I think you can even download it, yeah, in Excel form. I think they might be working with Michigan Audubon to get new checklists created that'll be printed for handing out at events and such. So I actually find this site really fascinating to kind of look through. The other one that would be really important is a review list, because if you see something that you think is rare, you may want to look and see if it's on this list. If it is, then they really highly encourage you to submit documentation. And you can see there's quite a long list, and these are all birds that have actually been seen in the state in the past, but are not considered regular enough to be considered a regular species. So they're still rare enough in occurrence to require to need documentation. You can see the committee votes in rounds, so you can kind of see some of the recent results of the various of recent rounds. You can see the results of those. Pretty fascinating to look through. I don't think they're completely caught up, but they're getting a lot closer than they used to be. There's a cool searchable database that you can actually search for a species and say, hey, has this ever been seen in Michigan? And you can see exactly when and where, and if there are photos of those records, you can see those. There's a photo gallery where you can look at birds that have been documented with photos and look at those photos. There's a tab over here, documenting rare birds, which actually offers advice on how to document rare birds. So a lot of the information that we're covering here is going to be found in here as well. Maybe some different takes on it than what I'm giving. So good to read through. The rare bird form, this is going to be the important one. If you have a rare species, you are going to document. The form, up until recently, it was a form you could download as a Word document and fill out and send into the current secretary. But recently, I haven't used this yet. There is also a link to a Google form where you can just fill it out online. So that's kind of nice, and getting into the modern era of rare bird documentation in Michigan. And then they have a series questions that are asked in both these forms. So if you don't want to download it, you're not comfortable submitting it through a Google form, you can kind of just copy and paste this into an email and send it to the secretary and fill it out. And a lot of these questions are the questions we're going to be covering in just a little bit. Some other cool stuff on their website, we're not going to really spend a lot of time talking about, discussing their annual reports, meeting minutes, committee members, past committee members, bylaws and policies. And I'll just leave you kind of to browse that stuff on your own if you'd like. Okay, going back to our presentation. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint again. Okay. So when to document rare birds? Now, this is going to depend on if you're looking through eBird or the MBRC. So eBird is fairly simple because it will actually prompt you to add comments before you can submit. I'm assuming if you're avid eBird users, we've pretty much all encountered this in the past. Um, just one note, this prompt to add comments is not the same as the frequency reported circles that came into the apps a couple of years ago and has caused some confusion. Those little orange and red circles that sometimes or that sometimes show up next to a species when you're entering it. That's different. It's just telling you how frequently a species is reported in that area and in that kind of general time frame. Not the same thing as an actual rare bird triggered by the filter. Because there's a lot of reasons that a species could be rarely reported. It could just be there's not a lot of people birding that area or not birding the correct habitat. So I just kind of want to clarify that because I see confusion about that quite a bit. Termination of if a bird needs comments is based on the filter set up by the experts. That can be adjusted to geographical areas and time frame. So the MBRC, they maintain a list of review species. You can see that tab on their website. We were just looking at it. If a species you encounter is on that tab, then they really request that you provide additional documentation so that it can be put into the official record, end up on the Michigan checklist, have its impact there, and also helps to, especially with species that are maybe moving north or expanding their range, it helps to kind of understand that range expansion to be able to document the actual movement of the species into the state. Fish crow is a recent example of that, so that's a really good one that we've documented pretty well, their expansion. Documentation is required for any sighting of a species not on the review list or that's not on the review list and is also not on the official Michigan checklist. So the review list does not contain every species in the world that is not considered regular in Michigan. It contains species that have been documented in Michigan, but not frequently enough to actually consider regular. So if you find something that's not on either list, then it also is probably a state first. And if you found a state first bird, congratulations, you are like a birding rock star now. So awesome. Good for you. That's something that most of us will never get to experience. But just so you know, if you think something's really, really rare, but you don't see it on the review list, check the Michigan checklist. If you don't see it there as well, then it is probably very rare, and you still would be encouraged to submit documentation. Okay, documentation is requested for some species at certain times of the year outside of certain counties. This is something that eBird does well with their filters. The MBRC doesn't focus on it so much, but there are kind of a couple of exceptions. Baird sandpiper is one example. Baird sandpiper, because of different migration strategies between spring and fall, they're not normally seen in Michigan in the spring. In fact, so rarely that the MBRC would like actual documentation if you see one in the spring. In the fall, they're perfectly fine. You can submit them on eBird. They're not even considered rare usually, at least not if you're on a coastal county. Same thing, there's not a lot of species that have any kind of geographical limits for the MBRC, but one example would be fish crow, which in the last couple of years I was on the committee was another thing we decided was that fish crows have really become pretty regular in Berrien County, but they are still incredibly rare anywhere else in the state. So if you see one in Berrien County, they don't want documentation, but if you see one in another county in the state, they really do still. So those are kind of some of the differences between the eBird and the MBRC. Okay, so let's go through some of my experience myself and being on the MBRC and talk about a few ways not to document rare birds. This is one we see frequently. It was sitting on a fence or hopping along on the ground. That's like the only bit of documentation that comes along. So as you can probably guess, if you're a reviewer or somebody trying to determine if they in fact think that the species matches up with the description, not really enough information there. Um, so when eBird asks for additional comments, they're really trying to say, hey, are you aware that the species is early, that it's rare? Can you describe it? And that's really what they're looking for, is a good description. Or, sometimes eBird will trip because you're reporting more than it expects, and then it just wants to know how you counted them. So we definitely want to get to a more detailed level than something like this. Um, although behavior, as we'll see, is actually, you know, it is relevant information. I mean, if you're saying that you saw a chimney swift and your documentation is you saw it sitting on a fence, that's a little unbelievable because, well, they tend not to do that. Um, I know what I saw. This is one we see quite a bit too, which is a really interesting one. Falls into the category of the passive aggressive comments that come out, I think, from people who have bad experiences with records getting rejected. The comments don't really help. They're kind of humorous. They make you chuckle a little bit, but um, usually they're followed by documentation that's falls into the poor category. So you can kind of understand why the person has had the records rejected quite a few times. If you know what you saw, you should be able to describe it in detail. So that's what they're looking for. Confirmed by Merlin. Yeah, this is a new one. We could have a whole presentation on what Merlin is good for and what it is not good for. It is, in fact, a helpful app that does a lot of really good things. However, like most AI applications, it needs somebody with knowledge to confirm it, not the other way around. Just consider whether it's audio or photo matching. Merlin should be taken as a suggestion and not as 100% truth. Otherwise, you might find, like me, car horns being identified as trumpeter swans, and my neighbor's peacocks too. It likes to confirm those as trumpeter swans. But there's also limitations with Merlin where it can't distinguish between some species that actually sound alike. And you can go out in the field with Merlin and have it going. Northern Michigan, we have a lot of red-eyed vireos. And you'll frequently encounter Merlin picking up red-eyed vireos, and there'll only be one bird singing, but it'll tell you there's red-eyed vireo there and that there's a Philadelphia vireo there because Merlin cannot tell those species apart. And there is a reason for that. And this is unfortunately not the presentation to get into that, but Merlin does have limitations like all AI technologies. So don't ever submit something or just because Merlin says that it's there. Get a good look at it or learn how to differentiate the vocalizations yourself so you can confirm it. Okay, and this one is just kind of funny. I put that in there because I think when I was on the MBRC, this was actually the only documentation we got once for a species. It was so cute. So not exactly helpful. Although, it probably was a cute bird. I will admit that. Okay, so how to document rare birds, just in general, a few things to keep in mind. We're going to focus a lot on record committee, just because that's where I encountered a lot. I'm not an eBird reviewer. I have not ever been one. So I don't know as much about their work, but I do know about being on the records committee. So one thing to keep in mind, records committee members vote only based on the documentation that is provided. They do not vote based on what they assume what they assume you meant, conversations they might have had with you. They can't do that because that gives one voter, more information to work with than other voters, and it's not a good thing. So think of it kind of like a court of law where, somebody says something and then, no, you got to strike that from the record. You can't consider it. That's kind of how the record committee votes in a little, or deliberates a little bit too. It's basically the documentation you provide is what they get to vote on. Also, the other thing I will say, I think I forgot to put it in here, is do remember that if you're submitting rare bird documentation, you're submitting something, that you saw something that is not supposed to be in the state. From a logic perspective, it means you're asserting something that's kind of unusual, and the burden of proof is on you. It's not the burden of the records committee to prove you wrong. It's the burden of them to look at your documentation and see if it meets the standards for acceptance. It's not a question of whether they believe you or don't believe you. I know in my time there, I did reject quite a few records that honestly, I believe the observer probably saw the bird that they claimed to see, but the documentation just wasn't good enough to meet the standard. So you vote to reject it for that reason. On the other hand, you get good documentation, it's accepted. And hopefully after this, you'll all be experts at submitting documentation. Record committee members govern only the Michigan's official checklist, not your life list. Kind of go back to the passive aggressive comment before. This seems to be something that sometimes is kind of forgotten by people. Records committee is not really their interest. Their interest is in the Michigan checklist. What you put on your life list is not really up to them. If you're like me and you have decided that if you see a rare bird, you're not going to add it to your life list unless the MBRC accepts it, well, then you just kind of got to accept what the MBRC votes. And if you're constantly getting rejected documentation, then you need to watch this presentation and figure out how to start getting it accepted. And also one thing just to clarify, a record is not the same thing as a sighting, because a record is basically saying that this species showed up at this location in the state from this state to this state, was potentially seen by many, many observers. So the MBRC does not vote on each individual person's documentation. They vote on whether or not they believe that that bird was there based on the documentation provided by however many people. And it kind of gets a little interesting because sometimes you vote on documentation and you accept the record, but you know that there are probably individuals within that documentation that actually did not see the bird. I can remember a record of voting on blue grosbeak, for instance, where there was a long-staying blue grosbeak downstate somewhere, and a lot of people saw it. A lot of people photographed it, documented it. It was very, very obvious, good record. It got accepted by the committee. But there were definitely a couple of people on there who submitted only photographs, and every single one of their photographs was actually an indigo bunting. So it kind of goes both ways. That's just kind of illustrates what I'm mentioning. The record is not the same thing as a sighting. So obviously the other documentation submitted by other people supported that there was blue grosbeak there, despite the fact that a couple of the individuals quite possibly did not actually see a blue grosbeak. So most records, including written-only records, do actually get accepted, despite anything you might actually hear to the contrary. You can actually, like I say, they're working on better communication. You can go onto the website and actually look at what records recently have been accepted and rejected, and usually you'll notice that the accepted outnumbers the rejected by quite a bit. Um, um, and from what I saw during my time on the records committee, I would actually say that when records get rejected, it's probably more likely that the reason for it was just poor documentation rather than noticeable misidentification. In other words, there are some birds that are photographed or contain written documentation that just doesn't make sense for the species that's claimed, so those are misidentification. There are others where the records or photographs are just not diagnostic, and the documentation is just uncertain, where it could have been that species. It could very well have been something else, and in that case, almost certainly the record is going to get rejected. So, okay. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how do we go about documenting rare birds. Okay, so the first question you're going to be asked if you submit a form to the MBRC is appearance. And this, as it will make clear, is the most important part of the documentation. You want to include a lot of detail. You can take photos, take notes, or better yet, both if you have a camera. Um, um, Mostly, and try to do this in the field, mostly so you don't have to rely on your memory. Memory is a very, very interesting thing if you've ever studied psychology, and it likes to tell stories and confabulate and do weird things. So if you get a quick look at a bird out in the field and then you go home and start looking through your field guides, and suddenly your memory can actually kind of change on you, and you start seeing things that you maybe didn't remember before you started looking at the field guides. So that's just an important thing to kind of keep in mind. Like I said, include as much detail as possible. And this is where reading that front of your field guide can help you try to describe every part of the bird that you possibly can. You know, the lores, the gape, the cheeks, the cap, the eye, rings, eye arcs, eye color, bill shape, bill color. I'm not going to read them all, but you kind of get the idea. This covers a lot of those feather groupings and bird parts that I talked about. Um, Obviously, you're not going to probably sit down and look at the photos and read the documentation and get them all at once, but if you keep studying it and then keep trying to apply it in the field over time, you can kind of understand it. You can kind of know what to do when you're actually out in the field and what you're looking at, which part of the bird you want to describe. And more importantly, in my case at least, I like to be able to just note these things as kind of shorthand in the field and then actually develop more of the narrative later. Um, but the more of this stuff you know by heart, the easier it will be. If you did not clearly see a part of the bird, state that in your description. That can be important. We don't, and also note that in the field, because if you go home and you didn't actually see the undertail coverts, but you start looking through the field guides, like I say, you know, memory can be kind of fickle in that way, and you might suddenly start remember seeing, you know, red undertail coverts on a gray catbird that wasn't actually a gray catbird and didn't actually have red undertail coverts. So good things to kind of keep in mind. Voice can also be very important. We're going to go back to this slide really quick because on the right-hand side, you'll see photographed a tropical kingbird that was observed in Chippewa County by a lot of people in October of 2016, found by one of Prass's own members, Steve Baker, in this case. So that was kind of cool. And then the following year, this bird on the right, which you might not be able to see very well depending on the size of your screen, but I apologize, that was the best photo I could get of this bird. That's a Couch's kingbird, photographed over in Alpena County the following year. If you've been to the Southwest, you know, the lower Rio Grande Valley, somewhere like that, where these two species occur, you're probably familiar with the problem that they actually look very, very similar, to the point where really about the only reliable way to tell them apart is by voice. So it is actually good in your documentation to include any vocalizations. I should say vocalizations or sounds, because sometimes wing beats make sounds as well. We're all familiar with the sounds that mourning doves make when they fly away. So if you see a bird out of the corner of your eye fly back behind you and you hear that distinctive noise, you know it's a mourning dove because nothing else really sounds like that. So it's really important, um, especially, it comes into play more where species can be easily confused with another species, and voice is really the way to tell them apart. And Pittonex flycatcher is a very good example. Up in northern Michigan, we really get alder and very rarely get willow flycatchers. Neither one of those are documentable species in Michigan. But just as an example, the easiest way to tell those apart, if you happen to be more in the overlap zone down in kind of the central part of the state, is by voice. Fish crows are another example. Um, just seeing a crow in the field without hearing it. Most places in Michigan, it's pretty safe to assume it's an American crow. But if you get down into the southwest corner where the fish crows have really been spreading, vocalization plays an important part. And if you're like me and you have no musical training whatsoever, this can actually prove kind of daunting, to be honest. Um, so just, study your field guides, look at the way that voice is kind of described, and understand how to tell the difference, as much as possible, and how you would want to try to describe the different species that are like that. It's Epidendix flycatchers, alders, is it free beer or is it Fitzview? Um, you can write that in your documentation. Fish crow, a little more complicated because young American crows can also have that nasally voice that we tend to identify with fish crow. But there are differences. How low was it? How short, long was the vocalization? Those things are kind of important because if you try to submit a fish crow and just say that it was nasally and it made a sound, that's actually not going to be enough. They really kind of want to know that you understand that young American crows make a very similar sound and how it's different. And if you can describe your fish crow vocalization and explain how it was different from an American crow vocalization, you're much more likely to get that record accepted. Um, and the tropical and couch's kingbird that we already discussed. Um, and if you did not hear the bird vocalize, just say so. That happens very frequently, especially outside of breeding season when birds are not as apt to be talking. So just do your best to describe any chip notes, songs, or wing sounds that you hear. Behaviors. We talked about sitting on the fence earlier. Not enough on its own, but behavior is important. What was the bird doing when you observed it? Did it exhibit any kind of hunting techniques like fly catching? Was it, sitting on a perch and making sorries out to grab something and then flying back to a perch? Was it a raptor that you saw going into a stoop while trying to go after um, another little bird, like a peregrine falcon would? Was it hunting on the ground? If so, was it scratching for seeds, trying to dig up seeds, trying to dig up invertebrates, anything yummy? Was it walking or hopping? Because that can actually make a very big difference in a lot of cases. A lot of tree perching birds that spend most of their time in trees actually hop more than walk, um, because that's more advantageous or closest, the most energy efficient way to hop from branch to branch, but it's not actually very energy efficient on the ground, where um, birds that frequently feed on the ground are much more likely to walk. Robins will do either, oddly enough. Okay, flight characteristics, we're all familiar, okay, looking at a distant bird and you're not sure if it's a crow or a raven, and then it starts soaring around. Well, okay, it's a raven. Um, Behavioral characteristics like that can be important. Was it flying with a dihedral? Important in some species. Turkey vulture is obviously an extreme example, but bald versus golden eagle. Goldens usually fly with a slight dihedral. That low bird you see flying low over the field or marsh and rocking back and forth with a strong dihedral could be a northern harrier. Is the flight wobbly? Is the flight undulating like woodpeckers frequently do? So try to describe all of that. Posture, and kind of, what it's doing, bobbing up and down like some shorebirds do, especially when they kind of feel nervous. Is it constantly pumping its tail? Um, you see a little yellow bird in a tree in the spring, and you notice it's just pumping its tail like crazy, even though you can't see it very well. Otherwise, you probably know it's a palm warbler. You're really lucky maybe to be a Kirtland's, but probably not around Petoskey. Is it upright? Does it stand upright? Does it stand a little more hunched? Characteristic that can be typical. Say you're looking at a brewer's blackbird, which tends to walk a little more upright than other blackbirds. So all those kind of things can be very good hints to what species you're looking at. So be sure to document them. Okay, kind of getting to the end here. I know we're going a little past 8, so try to document the habitat type, at least to the major habitat type. Was it in the field? Was it in the water? Was it in the woods? In a parking lot? Include more detail as well. Was it a hay field, a fallow field? One that's kind of was probably a agricultural field at one point, but is not been used in quite a while and is returning to nature. Was it a cornfield? Excuse me, cornfield. If it was in the water, was it in the Great Lakes, a little inland lake, a pond, marsh, fen, bog, stream, river? If it was in the forest, was it deciduous, coniferous, mixed, in a little forest glen or opening, or in a very wet forest like a swamp? All of that can be very useful information as well. How to document river. Oh yeah, this is actually a very important part as well. Similar species and how you eliminated them. This is the point where you get to tell the records committee that, yeah, you've done your homework, you know what other species the one you're claiming can be mixed up with, and you know why it's not actually one of those. You know why it's a blue grosbeak and not an indigo bunting, for instance, or some of those more extreme example or easy examples to come up with. So do you know what one thing about being knowledgeable about birding is just knowing what species the one you're looking at can be confused with. Do not only consider other birds common in Michigan where needed. We already talked about the tropical and the Couch's kingbird, which have both showed up in Michigan in recent years and are both actually rarities. Sometimes similar rarities can show up in Michigan, like I was just talking about, the tropical Couch's kingbird. And sometimes they can be easily confused with species that are more common. Blue grosbeak can obviously very easily be confused with indigo bunting, a lot of the impedimenta flycatchers, and so on. But you don't, of course, need to get out of control and consider every other bird species in the world as a possibility. And this is where it can kind of help, picking up books like the rare bird books, or can't think of the title of it now, but the bird about vagrancy, and kind of understanding patterns of vagrancy and what birds are likely to show up in Michigan. You can look through the review list on the MBRC's website and see rarities that already have shown up in Michigan. That gives you a pretty good idea of what is likely to show up in terms of rarity. It's a little weird to say we're talking about a bird being likely to show up when it's rare, but some rarities are more likely than others. So study your patterns of vagrancy. So, you don't need to compare your little Impedinex flycatcher that you see that you think might be a Western flycatcher species. You don't need to try to eliminate a bird from like Siberia or something like that, most likely. Um, So take a note of the descriptions you've provided and how they eliminate those similar species that you are claiming. And don't include features that you didn't include in your description. This is not a space where you are wanting to add additional details to your description. If you forgot to put something in your description that is relevant, go back and put it in your description. But it gets really confusing when you're looking at somebody's documentation, trying to vote on it, and they suddenly start saying that they eliminated a similar species because the undertail coverts on the bird they saw matches the species they claim, and not a similar species when they didn't actually mention anything about the undertail coverts in their documentation. It gets a little weird, and you never really know how to kind of deal with that. Um, Also, don't forget about hybrids. You don't need to worry about every species in the world potentially crossing with every other species in the world, but there are some hybrids that do occur in Michigan pretty frequently enough to be concerned about. I would say that these ones here that I've listed are the ones that are going to be the main concern. Rosses and snow goose can hybridize pretty frequently. So you really, really have to pay attention to the bill and head pattern on a small white goose that you see. Also, along with the Ross's goose, we'll just say we do get the subspecies lesser snow goose that comes through Michigan, which is also very significantly smaller than a Canada goose. So that is something to be aware of. They're closer probably in size to a Ross's goose than they are to a Canada goose. So, but they're kind of in the middle. So just keep that in mind as well. That is why Ross's goose documentation does need to be, you know, um, pretty detailed. Eurasian and American widgeon is another hybrid that shows up fairly frequently in North America, so you want to be on the lookout for. One that has in recent years kind of getting a little more attention is glossy crossing with white-faced ibis. A field guide will definitely show that they have kind of separate ranges, but if you start looking on eBird at adult birds during breeding season, you're going to find out that they're all over in each other's crib, you know, just hanging out during breeding season. So you got to imagine there's some quite a bit of interbreeding going on, and there have definitely been documented cases of these interbreeding. The problem is you have to see the bird fairly up close in order to notice those characteristics of a hybrid. So it's one that is getting a lot more attention now than it used to in the past. Eastern and spotted towhees. So if you find a spotted towhee in Michigan, you gotta be able to eliminate um, the hybrid, which is really confusing because the easiest way to do that is a little patch of feathers that eastern hybrids have at the base of their primary feathers, a little white patch. Spotted towhee does not, and hybrids typically show some of that. And to make it even more confusing, you kind of need to observe the bird for a little while to really make sure that you haven't seen it, because towhees really like to tuck that patch of feathers into their body feathers when they're sitting on the ground and at rest. So you kind of need to watch them for a while to actually make sure that that little patch is not there. Um, they like to make things difficult on us. And the white-headed gulls, large white-headed gulls, and just be aware we don't have quite as much of a problem with these our large white-headed gulls hybridizing like they do out west, where they really, they've coined the term for the hybrid swarm to talk about their gulls, and finding a pure gull out there is probably almost harder to do than finding a hybrid. We don't have quite as much of a problem with that, but hybrid gulls do exist, and there is one that does show up fairly frequently that's even been kind of dubbed the Great Lakes gull, which is a herring crossed with a great black-backed. which I spelled wrong. Shame on me. Um, anyway, it does kind of look like another gull species that has been coming through Michigan occasionally, called a slatyback gull, which is a gull that is kind of from Siberia and seen in western Alaska. So you do need to make sure that you understand the differences between that hybrid and the slatyback gull. So both would be rare. And Great Lakes gulls can oftentimes be mistaken for great blackback gull as well, just because they have a darker back than a normal herring gull and pink legs, but the back is not quite as dark as a normal great blackback gull, which is generally pretty much almost black. One you won't be asked to document, but I do want to cover because this one comes up in our area pretty frequently, is the golden wing crossed with a blue-winged warbler. Probably not, you're not going to be asked to document them. We are kind of right in the area where blue-winged warblers are expanding their range northwards, and where we do have golden-winged warblers historically have nested here pretty frequently in the right habitat. So if you're birding, say, like in the Jordan River Valley along Jordan River Road or somewhere like that, I would say when I'm down there, I encounter probably as many, if not more, hybrids between these two than I do the pure birds. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, you know, when you're over at like Tawas during the festival weekend and everybody's hearing a golden winged warbler and gets really excited, and then they finally see it and put it on their list, and you might be looking at it and saying, that's a hybrid. So keep that in mind. And you probably, in this area, you probably shouldn't report either of those birds based simply on vocalization. So this is another one where Merlin, voice identification, probably not going to help. Okay, just a few other things to keep in mind. What previous experience that you're going to get asked, what previous experience do you have with the species that you're claiming? Sometimes it's pretty easy. You know, you're seeing a vermilion flycatcher, you know them well, you lived in Arizona for 5 years, saw them all the time, no problem. What previous experience do you have with a similar species that you're trying to eliminate? Just kind of want to get an idea for how familiar you are with all of these. Um, Also, how far away were you from the bird? How did you estimate that distance? Because obviously seeing a small songbird at 400 yards through your scope is not quite the same as having it on your window feeder right next to your desk. And you kind of want to know that. Google Maps can help here too. If you know the bird's sitting on a structure or something and you happen to know where you were level to that relative to that structure, you can use their measure distance feature to help. If you happen to be on the border, it can kind of help to estimate how far the bird was out in the water or whatever, and to kind of get an idea of whether maybe it was on the Michigan or Canada side or something like that. They want to know what equipment you use: binoculars, scope, none. That's okay. You can sometimes see birds when you don't have optics with you. Nothing wrong with that. But they want to know. What were the light and weather conditions? Was it dark and cloudy and overcast? Was it lightly overcast, where it actually provides really nice diffused lighting? If it was a sunny day, where was the sun in relation to you? So we can kind of understand, what time of the day was it? So you can kind of understand if you were looking at a bird that was front lit, side lit, or backlit. So it's backlit, it's kind of hard to see color then. Okay, winding down here. Were there other observers with you, and did they agree with your identification? This is kind of an interesting one I asked. If not, what were their concerns? Um, it's kind of seems like a strange question to ask, but the reason I've seen this come up is as I've actually been asked to submit documentations on a bird that I saw when I was with a group that were claiming to have been able to identify it to species that I did not I was not comfortable with identifying it as species. I think it was a Jaeger, so that's pretty understandable. That happens quite a bit. And they'll ask me like, okay, can you submit all of your details and we can compare the notes and everything with what they say and just what everybody else says and see if your concerns are legitimate. Happens with ibises a lot. A lot of young ibises can't be ID'd to either glossy um, or white-faced, and sometimes happens with like those golden-winged and blue-winged warblers, where a lot of people are going to report it as a golden-winged, and it turns out it's really there's concern that there's probably a hybrid. When did you first write down your notes? Was it when you were in the field? Was it, 5 weeks later? Um, did you consult field guides or other reference material? Nothing wrong with consulting your field guides. As you probably know, I've been encouraging everybody to look at their field guides frequently this whole time, and I think it's a very important thing to do. But it is important to understand, did you do it before, after, during? If you're doing it before, you're going to a known rarity site to see a rarity that's known to be there. I like to study up before I go. If you're seeing something, you're not sure what it is, pulling out your field guide on your phone or a book or whatever, while you're looking at the bird, is perfectly fine too. But if you're looking at it after you saw the sighting, do you have notes or you're writing your notes after you've looked through the field guide? Because that's where memory kind of gets into it, and the fact that memory can, kind of adjust itself based on expectations and other information. Okay, did you obtain photograph? Please submit them. And how do I document rare birds? We'll just kind of go really quickly through this. A bad example is, it was gray on top with the orange on the bottom. Actually better, birds observed for around 5 minutes from blah. I'll let you read that, or I'll try to let you read that. And